Laura Bennett moved through Sacred Heart's ICU at 11 p.m. like someone who had learned long ago that the smallest adjustments prevented catastrophe. Her hands worked the medication cart with practiced efficiency, each vial checked twice against the patient chart, each line inspected with the kind of attention most nurses reserved for their own children. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that endless electrical drone that most people stopped hearing after the first week, but Laura heard it the way she heard everything in hospitals now, as data. A change in pitch meant a failing ballast. A flicker pattern meant voltage instability. Information. She didn't tremble. Not visibly. The barely perceptible tremor in her fingers when she held a syringe was something she managed with practice, gripping the cart handle as she moved between beds so the shake would read as grip, not fear. Muscle memory was reliable. Fear was not. Bed 12. Mrs. Chen, post-op day 2, vital stable, but her magnesium was running low and the resident had ordered it too fast. Laura adjusted the infusion rate downward, making a notation in the electronic chart. The resident would likely not check her work. They rarely did. But if Mrs. Chen had a cardiac event from electrolyte imbalance, it would be documented that the flow rate had been corrected at 11:17 p.m. by RNL Bennett. Insurance companies understood documentation. People understood it less. Bed 14 was a transfer from the step-down unit, a man named Rodriguez recovering from CABG surgery, coronary artery bypass grafting, for vessels, a procedure that required the kind of precision Laura respected. The cardiac surgeon, Dr. Morrison, had done clean work. The closure was perfect. Laura checked the wound dressing, noting that the subcutaneous layer showed appropriate healing for day 4. She made a mental note to monitor for any sign of infection. The smallest discoloration could mean the difference between routine recovery and sepsis. Data. Bed 17 was where everything changed, though Laura did not know it yet. Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Air Force, lay with the kind of institutional stillness that came from years of military discipline enforced against the reality of a failing body. Post-cardiac catheterization, admitted for arrhythmia management, his chart read like a medical textbook compiled in the language of expensive insurance claims. He had been brought in for a routine consult from a cardiologist, though nothing about cardiac disease was routine. His wife had sat beside him for the first 2 days, holding his hand with the grip of someone convinced that letting go meant losing him. She had gone home yesterday. He had not asked her to stay. "Water," he said when Laura entered, not looking at her face. His eyes remained fixed on the television mounted in the corner, where the news played without sound, closed captions describing a world he no longer inhabited with the kind of attention it deserved. "One moment, Colonel," Laura said, and she moved with the economical efficiency of someone who understood that military men responded to precision and brevity. She filled a cup from the bedside pitcher, the ice water creating that particular sound, the clink of cubes settling, that meant hydration and normalcy and the small mercies hospitals provided to the dying. As she adjusted his foreline, her sleeve rode up, exposing the burn scars that traced her left forearm like a topographic map of a place she no longer discussed. 3 pale lines, ragged at the edges, the kind of scarring that came not from accident but from impact. From proximity to something that burned very hot, very fast. She pulled her sleeve down immediately, a gesture so practiced it looked like a reflex. The colonel did not see it. Or if he did not register it. His eyes remained on the closed-captioned news. Laura Bennett had carried Marcus Webb 3 miles through Ramadi gunfire in 2008, after his convoy was struck by an IED that destroyed the second Humvee and left him bleeding from shrapnel wounds that would have killed him if she had hesitated even once. His name, or rather her designation, was tattooed on his left forearm in block letters, L. Bennett. Proof of survival. Proof of salvation. He looked at her now like any other nurse in the hospital, competent but faceless, part of the infrastructure of recovery rather than the architect of it. That was the way she preferred it. 15 years and PTSD had changed her enough that survival looked like anonymity. She was checking the monitor readout when Dr. Hargrove entered the ICU. His shoes announced him first, Italian leather, expensive, the kind that clicked against hospital tile with a rhythm that said expensive education and private club membership, and the particular arrogance that came from being born into money and reinforced by decades of deference. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, which meant he had spent his life saving hearts that failed, which meant he understood the physics of human mortality in ways that most people could only theorize about. What he did not understand was restraint. Hargrove's eyes found Laura at the medication cart, and something shifted in his expression, the kind of microsecond calculation that happens when a predator assesses a potential threat. She was double-checking a medication order. Her hand was on the chart for bed 19, where a post-op patient was scheduled for a discharge the following morning. The order was for morphine, for milligrams for pain management. The dosage was correct for a patient of that body weight, on day 3 post-op. But it was also higher than the standard discharge day dose, and Laura was comparing it against the patient's prior admission records, cross-referencing it against her medication calculator, the kind of diligence that most nurses performed once per shift and many skipped entirely. Hargrove noticed this. What he noticed more was that it threatened him. For 6 months, he had been running a side operation with a medical equipment company, a company that supplied hospital ventilators, monitoring systems, infusion pumps, and other devices that hospitals purchased in bulk at inflated prices. Hargrove received kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. $40,000 per month, deposited into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, for equipment orders that he approved and that somehow always exceeded what the hospital actually received. A 20% markup that nobody questioned because equipment budgets existed in a category of institutional spending that most administrators processed without individual line item scrutiny. Until the pharmacy started questioning some of those charges. Until the night nurse started asking questions. Laura moved through the hospital like someone conducting an audit, checking charges against deliveries, comparing invoice dates against item receipt dates, the kind of forensic attention that would eventually reveal that Sacred Heart had paid for 300 ventilator monitors over the past year but had received only 211. Hargrove had been watching her for 3 weeks. The next morning, a post-op patient named James Whitmore was being prepared for discharge. His wife had arrived at 9 a.m., and his daughter, a woman named Catherine, who worked in healthcare administration for a different hospital, had come with her mother. They were celebrating. Discharge was recovery. Discharge was the beginning of the return to normal life. Laura was adjusting his final medication, a pain management prescription for home use, when Hargrove entered the room with the kind of entrance that required attention. His voice had the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Hold that medication," he said, speaking not to Laura but to the space where she occupied the room. Laura looked up. 17 years of military training made her catalog details automatically. Hargrove's tie was Hermes. His watch was a Rolex Submariner. The room's temperature had changed by approximately 2 degrees because of the stress hormone response happening in 3 bodies simultaneously. "The dosage matches the chart, Doctor," Laura said. Her voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that came from someone who had learned that volume was not the same as authority. "I'm aware of what the chart says," Hargrove replied. He stepped closer to the forestand, his presence making the space smaller. "What I'm asking is whether you verified the dosage independently." "I did," Laura said. She did not move. Her hands remained exactly where they were. "For milligrams for a 78-kilogram patient on day 3 post-op, standard protocol." "Standard protocol," Hargrove repeated. He was looking at the medication vial now, holding it up to the light in a way that suggested he was examining it for flaws rather than verifying anything about its contents. "You understand that when you question the judgment of the surgeon who performed the operation, you undermine the authority structure of this hospital." The room went silent. The kind of silence that precedes something. Laura had heard that silence before, in different contexts, in different countries, when someone with institutional power decided to demonstrate that power publicly. "I'm not questioning your judgment," Laura said. "I'm confirming the dosage." "You are standing in front of this patient's family," Hargrove said, and implying that I made an error. "That is insubordination. That is clinical judgment deficiency on your part, and I will not have it in my ICU." He had said my ICU. The hospital had dozens of ICUs. None of them belonged to him. But he said it anyway, the way men with expensive watches said things, as if the statement of ownership made it true. "Yes, doctor," Laura said. She administered the medication. Her hands did not shake. When she left the room, the daughter was already crying, though whether it was from joy at her father's discharge or confusion about the scene she had just witnessed remained unclear. In the break room, the shift change was happening. 7 p.m. nurses moving toward the exit, night shift arriving like a changing of the guard. Laura entered, and the room's energy changed the way air pressure changes before a storm. Conversation stopped. Conversations that had not involved her immediately became very focused on the coffee machine, the refrigerator, the bulletin board where the hospital posted scheduling announcements. "You're on thin ice," someone said quietly. A nurse named Patricia, who had been kind before, who had shared lunch with her, who had suddenly become very distant. "With Hargrove. Just so you know. Don't ask questions around him." "Thank you for the warning," Laura said. She did not add anything more. She had learned long ago that explanations were a kind of weakness. You explained yourself when you needed others to understand you. When you accepted that you were not understood, explanations became unnecessary. The night shift stretched ahead of her. 12 hours in the ICU, 12 hours of monitoring, 12 hours of the kind of attention that most people would never witness or appreciate. She would watch the machines. She would watch the patients. She would watch for the smallest indication that something was changing, failing, dying. And in bed 17, Colonel Marcus Webb would sleep, his name tattooed on the forearm of a woman he no longer recognized, the woman who had carried him out of Ramadi when everyone else had moved on. The bulletin board outside the ICU nursing station held schedules, safety notices, and birthday announcements. At 7:45 in the morning, it acquired something else. Laura found it during the shift change briefing, when the day nurses were filtering in and the night crew was preparing handoff reports. The paper was cream-colored, official letterhead from the Medical Quality and Standards Committee. Her name was printed on it, formal and cold, RNL Bennett. Written warning, it read. Insubordination. Undermining physician authority. Clinical judgment deficiencies. She stood in front of it without moving. Around her, staff members glanced at the notice, then at her, then away, the way people look at a car accident they don't want to see clearly. 12 people had gathered for shift change. Within 30 seconds, the group had thinned to 4, then 2, then none. The bulletin board hummed beneath the fluorescent lights, that mechanical white noise that hospital people learned not to hear. Laura read the notice 3 times. Her hands hung at her sides, perfectly still. The words didn't change on the second reading or the third. Dr. Hargrove's signature was at the bottom in blue ink, each letter precise and confident, the handwriting of someone who had never doubted his own authority. She turned away from the board and walked to the break room. The space was empty, that absence was almost visible, a weight in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. Sophia had been sitting here an hour ago with her lunch. Jenna usually stayed 15 minutes past shift end. The residents rotated through constantly, looking for decent coffee and a place to sit where patients couldn't find them. The break room refrigerator hummed its own isolated frequency. Laura opened her locker and pulled out her jacket. The faded unit patch was still sewn into the lining where she'd stitched it 18 years ago, the emblem worn almost colorless by time. Sometimes her fingers found it when she needed to remember that the person she had been was real. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since the day she drove away from San Diego. But in that moment, standing alone in an empty break room, one tear escaped down her cheek before her brain could order her to contain it. She wiped it with the back of her hand like it was blood from a nosebleed, efficient, clinical, without sentiment. The walk from the break room to Dr. Hargrove's office took 47 seconds. She knew because she counted them in her footsteps. The hallway outside the ICU was beginning to fill with morning bustle, families arriving for early visiting hours, transport techs pushing beds, housekeeping moving through with their carts. Nobody noticed a single night nurse moving against the current of the day shift. Hargrove was at his desk, typing on his computer with his door propped open. He was a man built for authority, silver hair that probably cost $100 a month to maintain, a watch that gleamed like a weapon, the kind of presence that made people straighten up without knowing why. He looked up when her shadow crossed his desk. "Nurse Bennett." Not a greeting. An announcement of her arrival, the way you might note that a particular problem had walked into your office and closed the door behind itself. The write-up. She kept her voice level. Not deferential. Not angry. The voice she had learned to use in Ramadi when there was no time for tone, only content. Insubordination for questioning a medication order. A concern was raised about your clinical judgment. By you. He set down his pen. The gesture was calculated, a man giving his full attention to something beneath him. You undermined me in front of a patient's family. That behavior reflects poorly on this department and on my authority as the attending surgeon. Laura maintained eye contact. Her jaw was tight, but her voice didn't follow. It came out steady, which was sometimes harder than sounding angry. I've seen what real failure looks like, doctor. I've seen people die because nobody questioned an order. I've seen it happen in places where the consequences were a lot more permanent than a written warning. This isn't it. She turned and left without waiting for a response. The hallway was busier now, and nobody looked at her as she walked past. In his office, Hargrove sat very still, his pen suspended above his desk. His jaw tightened in a way that only happened when someone had said something he couldn't immediately counter. He set the pen down with more force than necessary and reached for his phone. The first call went to Douglas Whitmore, the hospital board president, a man Hargrove played golf with every other Saturday at the country club. "Doug. We need to talk before the day gets away from us." He didn't wait for a greeting. Men like Hargrove didn't waste time on pleasantries with men like Whitmore. "We've got a situation developing with one of the night nurses. She's practicing outside her scope, and I'm concerned about liability." The second call went to Patricia Hayes in Human Resources. Her son had needed a medical school recommendation letter 3 years ago, and Hargrove had provided one so glowing it practically sang. "Patricia, I'm documenting a pattern of insubordination that I think you need to be aware of. When this escalates, and it will, I need you ready to move quickly." The third call went to Edmund Price, a medical consultant who had built a comfortable career reviewing malpractice cases for physicians who needed expert testimony. Hargrove had referred several cases to him over the years. "Ed, I may need an independent review of some procedures performed by a nurse who's operating outside her training. Can you keep your schedule flexible for the next few days?" The fourth call was to his medical supply partner, the man who managed the equipment contracts that had created his monthly supplemental income. "She's asking questions about the discrepancies. The one we discussed. We need to bury this in paperwork before it becomes a problem." By the time he hung up, Hargrove had rebuilt his composure. The room was quiet again, orderly, under control. He had spent 30 years climbing the hospital hierarchy, learning that power wasn't about being louder than everyone else. It was about having allies in the right places. It was about knowing which administrators owed you favors and which would answer your calls at 7 in the morning. It was about being the man that other men like Whitmore and Hayes and Price didn't question. Meanwhile, Laura sat in her car in the parking garage, the Houston summer heat already shimmering off the concrete. Her shift had ended at 7:30. She should have been driving home to try to sleep before evening came around and she had to think about coming back. Instead, she was sitting in the driver's seat with her phone in her hand, staring at a text message from her daughter. "Mom, why do you work so late? You never talk about your job." Kaylee was 16 now, old enough to notice that her mother worked nights at a hospital but somehow never brought home any stories about it. Most mothers talked about difficult patients or interesting cases. Laura had learned long ago not to talk about her work at all. Stories required context. Context required history. History required the truth. She typed a response, "Just busy, honey." Deleted it. Typed again, "It's complicated." Deleted it. Finally settled on something short enough to be safe. Just busy, honey. Love you. She sent the message and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she heard the sound of helicopter rotors cutting the air above the streets of Ramadi. Black Hawk blades moving fast enough to push the heat away, coming in low over the buildings. The memory was sharp enough that she could smell the jet fuel, could feel the turbulence against her body, could hear the radio chatter crackling in her headset. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, forcing her breathing to slow. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. The same technique she'd learned in a base medical training facility 18 years ago. The same technique that had kept her alive through 3 tours and the dark years after. The Black Hawk sound faded. The parking garage came back into focus, concrete, fluorescent lights, the distant sound of a car door slamming 3 levels down. Upstairs in the ICU, Colonel Marcus Webb was being prepared for transfer to a regular patient room. His rib fracture was healing well. The chart marked it as stable and recommended overnight observation before discharge tomorrow afternoon. Nobody noted that the original car accident report had been vague about the details. Nobody flagged that a man his age shouldn't have ribs that broke quite so easily unless something else was going on. Laura would have noticed. She had spent years noticing things that didn't quite fit. But she wasn't in the ICU anymore. She was sitting in a parking garage, gripping a steering wheel, trying to remember how to be the person her daughter thought she was. Behind her, in Sacred Heart Hospital, the machinery of institutional power was already turning. Whitmore had received Hargrove's call and was making a note in his calendar to discuss it with Patricia Hayes. Hayes was pulling up personnel files and thinking about the cost of a wrongful termination lawsuit. Price was moving a cancellation around and clearing space for an independent medical review. The machinery was well-oiled and practiced, the kind of machinery that moved smoothly because it had moved the same way 1,000 times before. And nobody in that machinery knew they were about to collide with something that couldn't be moved. The machinery didn't understand that it was grinding toward a woman who had survived things far more catastrophic than institutional politics. Not yet. At 1:45 a.m., the ICU hummed with its usual midnight rhythm, ventilators wheeling their mechanical breath, monitors tracing the thin line between life and something else. Laura pushed the medication cart down the corridor, her eyes tracking the patient board with the precision of someone who'd learned that details were the difference between going home and going to the morgue. Bed 17. Colonel Webb. His vitals had been stable at midnight. Respiratory rate 16, oxygen saturation 96%, heart rate in the 70s. The kind of numbers that let you sleep. She'd checked him herself, watched his chest rise and fall in that rhythm that meant the body was doing what bodies were supposed to do. But something had shifted in the last 90 minutes. The monitor was showing shallow peaks instead of the deep valleys it should have been showing. Laura entered his room without the aggressive cheerfulness that some nurses used on night shift, the performative brightness that made patients feel like entertainment. She simply appeared, checking the fall line, the monitor connections, the catheter output. Professional. Invisible. The way she'd learned to be. Then she noticed his breathing. 22 breaths per minute. Up from 16. His chest was moving fast, shallow, like he was panting from a dream he couldn't wake from. The kind of rapid respiration that didn't announce itself on a monitor alarm, it just was, a slow drift upward that the automated systems wouldn't catch until it became a crisis. Laura's hand moved to the stethoscope hanging around her neck, the motion smooth as muscle memory. She placed the diaphragm against his left chest wall, just below the collarbone. Diminished breath sounds. Almost absent. Her fingers moved across the intercostal spaces, checking again. I'll be there in a few minutes. Probably just anxiety. She didn't argue. Arguing was listed on her write-up as a failure of appropriate professional hierarchy. Instead, she hung up the phone and sat in the chair beside Webb's bed, watching his oxygen saturation, watching his respirations, watching the way his chest was working harder with each breath. At 1:52 a.m., his O2 sat was 92%. At 1:58 a.m., it was 89. At 1:59 a.m., Dr. Morrison appeared with a yawn that suggested he'd been sleeping, not just waiting in the call room. He looked at the monitor. He looked at Webb. He looked at Laura. At even 2 milligrams, he said. Anxiety manifests as respiratory distress in older patients. His trachea. Noted in the chart, Nurse Bennett. I'll examine him. He did examine him. A quick listen with his stethoscope, a look that suggested he was checking boxes on a mental form, a pat on Webb's shoulder that was meant to be reassuring and landed like dismissal. Then he was writing something in the chart and leaving with the satisfied air of a man who'd solved the problem and could go back to sleep. At 2:48 a.m., the monitor didn't scream. It shattered the silence like a gunshot. Alarm screaming in 3 octaves, the heart rate alarm, the oxygen saturation alarm, the apnea alarm. Laura was on her feet before the first note finished, moving to Webb's bedside. His oxygen saturation was 78%. Falling. His lips were turning blue. His face was going grey, and his head was tilted at an angle, and Laura could see it now, the trachea, the windpipe, visibly shifted to the left, pushed there by something, compressed by something building pressure inside his chest cavity where it had no right to be. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pushing on the heart, pushing on the vessels, a slow suffocation in real time. Morrison ran in, or something like running, more of a panicked shuffle. He reached for the crash cart. Then he reached for it again. Where's the needle? Where's the... His hand shook, and Laura understood in that moment that some people knew medicine the way people knew textbooks, and some people knew it the way they knew how to survive. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Training doesn't stay in your muscles for 15 years because it forgets, it stays because it's been written in nerves and synapses by the kind of necessity that shapes bone. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, the blue one, long enough to reach through muscle and pleura, and she counted ribs with 2 fingers the way she'd been trained a decade and a half ago in a place that still woke her screaming. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle went in at an angle. Skin. Muscle. The feel of resistance, and then the give. A hiss. Not like a whisper. Like the release of a pressure valve on something that had been building. Air, compressed and angry, escaping from Webb's pleural cavity where it should never have been. The hiss of pressure releasing. Webb gasped. His eyes opened wide. Color started to come back into his face. You're okay, Laura said, and her voice was steady, the voice of someone who'd done this before, who'd done this while shells fell around her and her uniform was covered in dust and blood that might have been hers or might have belonged to someone else. You're going to be okay. The oxygen saturation climbed. 82%. 88. 94. 100. Sinus rhythm on the monitor, steady and strong, the rhythm of a man whose body was getting oxygen again, whose heart wasn't being crushed anymore, whose lung was re-inflating because the pressure that had been killing him was gone. Morrison was staring at her. At the needle in her hand. At the patient who was suddenly breathing, suddenly pink, suddenly alive in a way he hadn't been 30 seconds earlier. You just performed an invasive procedure without authorization, Morrison said, and there was something in his voice that made Laura understand this was about to become complicated. Not appreciation. Not gratitude. Complication. He was in cardiac arrest, Laura said. Secondary to tension pneumothorax. She didn't look at Morrison. She was watching Webb, watching his chest rise and fall with the rhythm of actual breathing, watching the numbers on the monitor stabilize. His trachea was shifted. His oxygen saturation was 78 and dropping. You should have waited for Morrison started, then stopped, because what could he say? That he should have waited for the doctor to arrive while the patient died? The words died in his mouth. At 2:10 a.m., Hargrove appeared in the doorway. Called, no doubt, by Morrison. Hargrove, who'd been sleeping or not sleeping, who'd been somewhere in his beautiful house in the Bellaria neighborhood, who'd been thinking about something other than the ICU, was now looking at a patient who was stabilized. looking at his nurse, standing with a needle still in her gloved hand, looking at a procedure that had just been performed outside of authorization, outside of protocol, outside of the hierarchy that kept people like Hargrove in power and people like Laura in their place. She watched his face shift. Confusion. Then comprehension. Then something that looked like satisfaction, and that was the moment Laura understood she'd just handed him exactly what he needed. Dr. Hargrove arrived at the ICU at 2:10 a.m., 10 minutes after Laura had stabilized Colonel Webb's chest. She was still standing over the bed, her gloved hand steady, the 14-gauge needle catching the fluorescent light as she prepared to document what she'd done. The moment he saw her there, saw the needle, saw the arterial blood still glistening on the gauge, saw the oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor, his expression shifted. Not with gratitude. With something else entirely. Recognition. The kind of recognition a predator shows when it realizes its prey has just handed it a weapon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply turned and walked out, and Laura watched him go, her hand steady as surgical steel even as her mind caught up with what she'd just done. She'd performed an invasive procedure without explicit physician authorization. She'd violated the scope of practice that kept her licensure intact. She'd saved a man's life and committed a crime doing it, all in the span of 90 seconds. By 3:13 a.m., Hargrove was on the phone with Douglas Whitmore, the hospital board president and his golf partner of 17 years. "We have a patient safety issue," he said, his voice measured, clinical, the voice of a concerned physician rather than a man protecting a $40,000 monthly income stream. A night shift nurse performed an emergency surgical procedure without proper authorization or supervision. The resident on duty was bypassed entirely. This needs immediate review. Whitmore, still half asleep in his $3.2 million River Oaks Colonial, promised action. By 3:53 a.m., Hargrove was on the phone with Patricia Hayes in the HR department. Hayes had written a recommendation letter for her son's medical school application 2 years prior, a letter that had made the difference in his acceptance to UT Southwestern. She owed Hargrove a favor. "I need documentation of a policy violation," he told her. "Unauthorized invasive procedure. Night shift RN. I'm requesting an external investigation to maintain objectivity." Hayes was awake now, alert, already opening files. By 4:15 a.m., Hargrove called Edmund Price, the external consultant he'd personally selected from a private medical compliance firm that had audited Sacred Heart 3 times before. Price owed Hargrove a consulting fee of $8,500 per investigation, a steady income stream that required maintaining favorable relationships. "I'll need to review the incident report and interview staff by 7:36 a.m., Price said. "This sounds like significant scope violation. I'm prepared to recommend suspension pending full investigation." The network activated with the precision of machinery that had been oiled and maintained for years. Board president. HR director. Handpicked consultant. Each call a domino, each domino falling exactly as planned. By 5:13 a.m., an email landed in Patricia Hayes' inbox from Hargrove with the subject line marked urgent, patient safety incident. At approximately 2:48 a.m. on date, RN Bennett performed needle decompression for tension pneumothorax without explicit physician authorization. Resident Dr. Marcus Chen has filed report stating he did not authorize this intervention and was not present during procedure. This represents unauthorized invasive surgical procedure outside scope of nursing practice. Recommend immediate suspension pending external investigation. Dr. Hargrove. By 7:36 a.m., Laura was called to the HR office on the 3rd floor. She sat across from Patricia Hayes, still in her scrubs from the night shift, the cotton damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. Edmund Price sat on speakerphone, his voice crackling through the speakerphone with the authority of someone who'd already decided her fate before hearing her explanation. "Ms. Bennett," Patricia Hayes began, her voice apologetic in a way that made it worse, "you performed a needle decompression on a patient last night. A procedure that falls outside the scope of nursing practice." She slid a laminated copy of hospital policy across the desk, Section 4.2.1, invasive surgical procedures must be authorized by attending physician prior to execution. Laura kept her voice level. The composure of someone who'd survived worse than this. The patient had tension pneumothorax. Tracheal deviation. Oxygen saturation at 54 and dropping. The resident has submitted a report stating he did not authorize your intervention, Edmund Price interrupted from the speaker. That he was, in fact, en route to the patient when you performed the procedure without his knowledge. Laura had expected this. She'd known, the moment she saw Hargrove's face at the bedside, that she'd walked into a trap. But knowing and experiencing were different things. Knowing didn't stop the room from tilting slightly. Knowing didn't silence the sound of her own heart, too fast, too loud, like it was trying to warn her of something her mind already understood. I understand, Laura said. The words came out steady. The patient required immediate intervention. In my clinical judgment. Your clinical judgment has been called into question by Dr. Hargrove, Patricia Hayes said. She wouldn't make eye contact. He's requested an external investigation into your practice patterns. The board has agreed to a full review. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. You should not return to work until we contact you. Suspended. The word hung in the air like a blade. No explanation to staff. No transition. No handoff for the patient she'd been managing. Just gone. Invisible. Erased. Laura stood. Patricia Hayes flinched slightly at the movement, as if expecting something. But Laura simply picked up the policy sheet and turned toward the door. Ms. Bennett, Patricia called out. Your access badge will be deactivated within the hour. Security will need it. Laura unclipped her badge from her scrubs pocket, 5 years of hospital shifts, 1,212-hour nights, uncounted lives, represented in a laminated rectangle with her name and photograph. She placed it on the desk without a word and walked out. The drive home took 18 minutes. She couldn't remember any of them. Traffic lights appeared and disappeared. Stop signs registered somewhere in the peripheral awareness that allowed her foot to find the brake. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with the same precision they'd gripped the 14-gauge needle, her knuckles white, her breathing controlled to the point of shallow. The radio played something she didn't hear. The city of Houston moved around her like water around a stone. Her house was dark when she pulled into the driveway. The morning sun hadn't yet burned off the humidity that clung to everything. She parked in the garage and sat in the car for 4 minutes, watching condensation bead on the windshield. Then she got out and went inside. At 3:41 p.m., Kaylee came home from school and found her mother at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs. Laura was staring at the faded unit patch sewn inside her old navy jacket, the one she kept hidden in the back of her bedroom closet, the patch she hadn't looked at in 15 years because looking at it meant remembering Ramadi, meant remembering what she'd done and what she'd lost. She was crying. Silent, shoulders shaking, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere beneath language, beneath control, beneath the careful architecture she'd built to keep her daughter safe from the truth. Kaylee dropped her backpack. Mom? Why are you home? What happened? Laura couldn't answer. She couldn't find the words that didn't contain 15 years of lies. She couldn't say, I was suspended for saving a life without explaining why she knew how to save that life, how she'd learned that particular emergency procedure in a city where explosions came without warning and men died in seconds and survival required becoming someone else entirely. She couldn't say the hospital fired me without explaining that the hospital had no idea who they'd fired, that they'd suspended a nurse but what they'd actually removed from their building was a woman who'd been trained by Task Force West and decorated for Valor under fire and tattooed her own call sign on the forearm of a dying colonel she'd carried 3 miles through streets where every window was a sniper position. Kaylee put her arms around her mother, terrified by the loss of control, by the sight of the one woman she'd believed unbreakable breaking. Mom, please. Tell me what's wrong. Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a movement sharp as a command. She stood. The sobs stopped as quickly as they'd started. The composure reasserted itself like armor clicking into place. I need to go back, she said, her voice level again, steady again, containing everything beneath a surface so smooth it reflected nothing. There's another patient coming in. I saw it on the schedule yesterday. Mom, you just got home. You're suspended. Then I'll go as a visitor, Laura said. She moved toward the hallway, toward her bedroom, toward the old navy jacket hanging in the back of her closet. Colonel Webb needs monitoring. The chest tube needs to be tracked. The resident won't catch complications a night shift nurse would see. Kaylee grabbed her mother's jacket sleeve. Then I'm coming with you. Laura paused, looking at her daughter's face, 16 years old and terrified, seeing her mother for the first time as something other than stable, something other than safe. She wanted to tell her no. She wanted to protect her from what was about to happen, from the truth that was about to arrive by helicopter, from the identity of the woman standing in front of her. But the moment for protection was over. The moment Hargrove activated his network was the same moment that network started moving upward, toward people with significantly more authority than a hospital board president. The moment Laura saved Colonel Webb was the same moment that decision began traveling through channels toward a Pentagon that had been looking for a missing senior chief for 15 years. Okay, Laura said. Get your shoes. 5 hours after Laura decompressed Colonel Webb's chest, the rotor wash shook the windows of Sacred Heart like thunder rolling across the city. A helicopter descended through the Houston heat haze, its landing skids touching the roof at 7:08 p.m. exactly. 200 Marines in dress uniforms, dress blues pressed sharp enough to cut glass, rifles held with the terrifying fluid precision of soldiers who'd walked through fire together, filed down the stairwells in formation. Their boots echoed on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound stopped conversations mid-sentence. Orderlies froze with blood cultures in their hands. The ICU nurses stepped back from their stations as the Marines moved through the lobby without a word, their presence making the air pressure change, as if the building itself recognized what had just arrived. The hallway outside Webb's room filled with uniforms before anyone understood why. A man in a wheelchair, scarred hands, burns mapping the left side of his face like a geography of survival, was being pushed toward the gathering crowd. Fahim al-Saleh. The name on his cardiology consult had meant nothing to the attending physicians. Just another patient. Just another routine case. Laura was reaching for his full line when he stopped the wheelchair with one hand and looked directly at her. His accented English cut through the fluorescent hum like a radio operator reaching across decades. The woman who killed Zarqawi's lieutenant to save the American colonel. Not a question. A statement. Muscle memory and shadow, spoken aloud. Laura's hands froze on the .4 bag. The color drained from her face in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with time collapsing, 15 years of careful forgetting reversed in a single sentence. Behind her, a voice she recognized before turning around. My mom's a senior chief petty officer. Kaylee stood in the doorway, still wearing her McDonald's uniform from the shift she'd cut short, her eyes moving between her mother and the 200 Marines as if she were seeing her mother for the first time. Laura's hands trembled as she pulled up Fahim's file on the monitor. Mission designations. Names. Coordinates. The red-line paragraph she'd spent 15 years trying to forget now swam before her vision, the numbers sharp and specific, Ramadi, 2008. FOB Shank. The Jolin District. The operation that had a name she could never say aloud. A door at the far end of the hallway opened. A captain, grey hair, lines around his eyes that came from squinting through desert sun, a bearing that belonged in command, stepped into the crowd of uniforms. His name was Chen. He'd extracted her unit from Ramadi on a UH-60M Blackhawk when everything went sideways. 15 years had aged him the way command ages men, but his voice still carried the same precision. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. He addressed the entire hallway, his words formal, official, the kind of words that belonged in court-martial proceedings or congressional records. Navy Cross. A pause. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next room wheeze its mechanical rhythm. 2 silver stars. Another pause. Each medal its own beat, its own silence. Received for actions in Ramadi that saved 17 American lives, including Colonel Webb's, a procedure she performed last night, the same procedure, while a surgeon with no combat experience questioned her clinical judgment in front of witnesses. Captain Chen's eyes moved to where Dr. Hargrove stood near the nurse station, his face already beginning to shift, the careful composure of a man who'd just realized his network was about to be illuminated from above. A two-star admiral appeared in the doorway behind Captain Chen. The room didn't just go quiet, the air itself seemed to compress. Admiral Vance. His dress whites carried ribbons Laura recognized: Desert Shield, Desert Storm, operations in places they didn't teach in nursing school. He walked past Dr. Hargrove without acknowledgement, without a glance, as if the surgeon had already ceased to exist in his presence. The Navy never stopped looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett. His voice moved like a blade through bone. She walked away 15 years ago because the nightmares were unbearable. Because watching medics die and soldiers die and realizing you couldn't save everyone broke something. So she found a different battlefield. This one. The Admiral turned directly to face Hargrove. His voice didn't rise. That's what made it terrifying. You suspended the woman who performed the same life-saving procedure last night that she perfected saving my Marines in Ramadi. A procedure you, Doctor, have never performed in your life. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The network he'd activated so efficiently that morning, the board president, the HR director, the consultant he'd hand-selected, was nowhere to be found now. Captain Chen stepped forward holding a folder. We pulled your records, Doctor. 43 equipment purchase orders that don't match inventory. Medical supplies billed at 300% markup. Kickbacks totaling $40,000 monthly from Apex Medical Supply. The hospital board president, Douglas Whitmore, went pale. His golf partner. His breakfast companion. His carefully cultivated professional relationship was evaporating in real time. James, what is he talking about? Hargrove pointed at Laura. This is a deflection, she violated protocol, she didn't have authorization. The Admiral's voice cut him off with the same precision it had used to command thousands. You're fired. 3 words. That's all it took to end his career. Effective immediately. In front of everyone here. The Marines remained at attention, silent witnesses to a judgment that needed no jury. Because that's what happens when you persecute warriors you're not fit to treat. Patricia Hayes from HR stood, her face reflecting something between anger and betrayal. Dr. Hargrove, security will escort you from the premises. Your hospital credentials are revoked. Your DEA license suspension is effective as of 2,100 hours tonight. We're forwarding the financial evidence to the State Medical Board and the FBI. The words landed like ordnance. News cameras that had somehow appeared in the chaos captured everything, Hargrove's face crumbling, mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, eyes darting for exits that suddenly seemed impossibly far away, his hand reaching for his phone with the desperation of a man watching his world calcify. Hargrove walked through the corridor of Marines. Each step echoed. His shoes clicking tile, the only sound in a hospital that had never been this quiet. A young Marine, probably 19, probably from somewhere in the Midwest, whispered just loud enough for the doctor to hear. Coward. The word hung in the air like a diagnosis. Outside, Hargrove sat in his Mercedes. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. His phone buzzed, texts from board members, from colleagues, all variations of the same message: distance, denial, severed connection. His network, activated so efficiently this morning with charm and leverage and careful phone calls, now evaporated like smoke. He started the car. Drove nowhere. Just moved through Houston streets he no longer recognized, a man who discovered too late that power built on corruption crumbles the moment someone brighter, stronger, more connected decides to tear it down. 6 months later, the hospital's new trauma center stood where the old East Wing had been, gleaming glass and steel, funded by a Naval Veterans Foundation grant that came with conditions Admiral Vance had carefully negotiated. The dedication ceremony filled the main atrium. Laura stood in her dress whites, ribbons across her chest that caught the light like medals you could see from across the room. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. 2 purple hearts. Her daughter Kaylee stood beside her in a matching uniform. She'd enlisted 3 weeks after the revelation, following her mother into a service her mother had spent 15 years trying to forget. The plaque read, Bennett Trauma Center, dedicated to Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, whose courage under fire saved 17 lives and continues to save lives here at home. Colonel Webb placed his tattooed forearm next to her name on the bronze plaque. Both of them were finally remembering who saved whom. His hand touched the letters. Her hand covered his. Neither of them spoke. Admiral Vance approached and presented Laura with her old trident pin, the one she'd left behind in Ramadi, the symbol of her service that she'd spent 15 years believing she'd forfeited. You walked away because the nightmares were unbearable. But you never stopped being a warrior. You just found a different battlefield. Laura's hands didn't tremble as she accepted it. The pin caught the light. Real gold. Real metal that had survived what she thought was impossible. A reporter in the back asked about Dr. Hargrove. Captain Chen answered from beside the Admiral. Last I heard, he's teaching CPR fundamentals at Houston Community College for $18 an hour. Across town, in a fluorescent-lit classroom, the kind with plastic dummies and vinyl chairs and students checking their phones, Hargrove demonstrated chest compressions to 19 students who weren't paying attention. The college supervisor observed from the back, clipboard noting his performance. After class, Hargrove walked to his 10-year-old Camry, the Mercedes sold months ago to cover attorney fees that hadn't prevented anything. At the dedication, Laura stepped to the microphone. She looked at her daughter, at Colonel Webb, at the Marine still standing at attention. Someone once told me that true class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching. When there's no glory, no cameras, no recognition. I learned that in Ramadi. I lived it here, in this hospital, every night for 15 years. And I'll keep living it, because that's what we do. That's who we are. The crowd stood. The camera crews lowered their equipment to applaud. Outside, the sun set over Houston, and Laura Bennett finally slept without nightmares. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more narratives about the quiet heroes walking among us. Drop a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And like this video if you believe that real strength shows itself when no one's watching.